Okay, here at the outset, we might cover a little bit of the same information that you saw at the end of the last video. I just want to be sure I'm not leaving anything out. So here we go again. We're going to quickly kind of go through this slide before we move on to the next. So when your period starts, what is being shed is your endometrial lining. Again, endometrial is, you can think of this as synonymous with uterine lining. This is what would have been available in order to support a fertilized egg in the event that fertilization occurred during your last cycle. And so here on cycle day 1, what is already happening in your ovary is that new follicles are forming, and every cycle you have more than one follicle developing. However, during every cycle, at some point, you'll also have one follicle, typically one follicle, selected as the dominant follicle. And the reason why I say typically one is because we all know that twins or even triplets, multiple births is possible. So sometimes there's more than one follicle that is selected that will then become sorry, I completely lost my train of thought here. Sorry for that interruption. So we all know about multiple births, and during that you would have more than one follicle that's actually selected to continue growing, continue developing towards that dominant follicle state, and then actually be released during that cycle. However, most of the time it's one follicle selected as the dominant follicle. That's the one that will continue to develop. That's the one where, all of these changes, which if you're curious kind of what those changes are, this is something that I go more into detail into in actually a different program on PCOS. But anyways, so all of these changes are happening. That follicle is rapidly growing during this time, and all of that starts even during your period. And the reason that starts during your period is because this is when your follicular stimulating hormone is already starting to rise in preparation of your follicular stimulating hormone. Again, is that hormone that feeds or fuels the development of the follicles. And then once you're done with your period on whatever day of your cycle that happens to be, those follicles keep right on growing. Once that dominant follicle is selected, it begins releasing estrogen. This provides that feedback to your brain to shut off follicular stimulating hormone, or FSH, and what that does, it effectively starves all of the rest of the developing follicles. So it's a very much every follicle for themselves kind of atmosphere, very, very much a Hunger Games kind of survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest here when in that race to become the dominant follicle. And then estrogen production continues by that dominant follicle up until ovulation. At ovulation, this is when the egg is released from the follicle. The follicular hull that is left behind then starts producing progesterone, and the reason why it starts producing progesterone is because that sustains that endometrial lining, that new uterine lining that is also rapidly developed as your estrogen increased, as your dominant follicle was growing for this cycle. And then that progesterone production follows a bell-shaped curve during the second half of your cycle to help sustain that endometrial lining, again in preparation, in the hopes that a fertilized egg will implant. So that's how estrogen and progesterone influence your uterus. Let's move on, talk about estrogen and progesterone, talk about your cervical fluid. So this is actually where we left off in the last video. And again, apologies for the rehash. I'm going ahead and leaving this here because, sometimes it's helpful to see stuff more than once. And I think, and also on any given day, I'm liable to explain this slightly differently in a way that, might click or might help just concrete this with you more so. So on this slide, what we're focused on here is all these images across the bottom, because this shows the consistency and the structure within your cervical fluid. And this is so beautiful. This is something that I just could wax poetic on for days. This is, we talked about electrolyte balance earlier, and it's actually that electrolyte balance that also impacts your cervical fluid and the structure of your cervical fluid. But the reason why this structure even matters is because this helps select the sperm that make it from your vagina through your cervix into your uterus, where then they can travel down the fallopian tubes in search of that egg that's released. So the structure of your cervical fluid helps control what sperm pass. And this is key because when we're talking about sperm, there may be a lot of them, but they're not all good quality sperm. And so your cervical fluid serves the function of kind of calling out the duds. And it does this with these different patterns of cervical mucus or cervical fluid. So this G-style fluid that you see before ovulation, and again, these are all, where is this seen? Well, this is seen under a microscope. This G-style mucus that is seen before ovulation effectively serves as a plug. And then there's also G-style mucus after ovulation. Either one of these, whichever one we're talking about, especially the one after ovulation, serve as a plug to plug up your cervix to keep sperm from bypassing and getting into your uterus. And this also plays a role in other things too. This helps protect you from sexually transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted infections, whether you think of them, whether you're old school and prefer to think of them as STDs, or whether you're, new school and STD is save the date and STI is sexually transmitted infection, whatever. Anyways, so it really serves a function, is to help protect your body during times when you're not able to get pregnant anyways. Because if there's no egg present and your egg only has a lifespan of about 12 to 24 hours, it's only viable for about 12 to 24 hours after it's released from that follicle. If it's not fertilized within that time period, it will naturally decay, just naturally die. So if there's no egg present, you're not able to get pregnant anyways. And then this is really your body doing its job to protect you from sexually transmitted infections. And it's also a way, because this is present after ovulation, it's, well, what if that egg was fertilized? Well, you don't want an infection in there posing a risk to in this part of your body that is now prepared to house a developing life. You don't want an infection in there, and you don't want anything in there competing with this developing embryo. So that's really the role and the purpose of this G-type mucus, especially after ovulation, is to protect those interlying organs, to protect your body from sexually transmitted infections. Effectively act as a plug to keep sperm and everything else from penetrating the cervix. Now, before ovulation, obviously menses has to pass out of your body, right? So the cervix can't be full of G-type mucus, the same G-type mucus that's present after ovulation, to form as tight of a plug. So it's got to allow for the flow of menses out of your body. It still is before ovulation, it's still a G-type mucus in the sense that it's not impacted by estrogen. So maybe this is a really good time to talk about what the difference is between these different numbers here. What is G mucus versus EL mucus versus ES mucus? Well, G type mucus, you can think of it as gestational mucus. This would be, or gestational cervical fluid, and this would be the kind of cervical fluid present when there's a fertilized embryo gestating, right? When it's developing towards a baby. Sometimes this is referred to as progesterone affected mucus. I think a better way to think of it is more so as estrogen deficient mucus, where estrogen isn't playing a role in the structure of it. So this leads us to EL type mucus. EL type mucus is estrogen. The easy way to think of this, and what's most what is the word I'm trying to think of here? What's most suitable for you as someone who's tracking your your cervical fluid to know when you're fertile, is to think of EL as estrogen low. And the reason for this is because now your cervical fluid is starting to be impacted by the presence of estrogen. However, estrogen is still low, so it's not to the most fertile quality type of fluid. However, this transition between G before ovulation, and again, here is cycle day 1. This is the day that you're starting to bleed, all the way up through this transition from G to EL. This is your point of change. This is where all of a sudden, things are happening quickly. That dominant follicle has been selected. That dominant follicle is growing, rapidly. You're getting close to ovulation. Ovulation is approaching. So think of this as EL type, or as estrogen low type mucus. There will be a TLDR, too long didn't read, video kind of tacked onto this. Like this, in this we're covering the basics. In that TLDR version, we'll go deeper into some of the other differences between EL and ES. Speaking of ES is high estrogen state. It corresponds to a specific quality, specific different qualities within your cervical fluid. These being stretchy, very lubricative, very slippery type cervical secretions. And there is a different pattern between this EL and ES. And again, that different pattern, it helps to both for sperm to transport between the vagina and the uterus, and then also to cull out the duds. So it's serving two purposes, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking EL or ES, they both do this. So what does this look like when you're tracking it? So this is where this is where pen meets paper, right? Or if you're tracking with an app, this is where your finger hits your phone screen. So when you're tracking this, you are tracking red for days when you're bleeding. You are tracking gray for days of G-type mucus. And see, it's nice how these colors kind of align, right? And then you're tracking blue. Light blue for your EL, so your low estrogen days are light blue. And then dark blue for your ES. So these are high estrogen days. These are days of stretchy, slippery, egg white cervical fluid. And if there are any confusing days, if there are any days of your cycle where you really don't know what you're looking at when we're talking cervical fluid, you would track those as yellow. So this is definitely an ideal cycle. So we have 5 days of bleeding, tracked as red, and then again, what's going on in your ovaries at the same time is you already have multiple follicles developing, and growing, and then at some point that follicle is selected as a dominant follicle, and when that happens, your estrogen starts to take off, and as soon as it hits a certain threshold, then the quality of your cervical fluid changes, and this enables sperm to pass from your vagina into your uterus. This is something else I should have mentioned, that the lifespan of sperm and the reason why your fertile window is longer than the lifespan of your egg is because sperm are able to live for up to 7 days inside your uterus. And this is that quote, that 7-day lifespan, is based on a fairly new research paper that found that up to 1% of sperm are able to survive for up to 7 days. Now, what you'll generally hear is that women are fertile for about 5 days of their cycle. What is true for you is you are fertile for as long as you have estrogenic quality cervical fluid present, plus 3 days after your last day of fertile quality cervical fluid. Why 3 days? Because typically, if you're tracking your luteinizing hormone, which, if you remember, your luteinizing hormone is the hormone that surges very close to ovulation. If you're tracking your luteinizing hormone, then generally speaking, the egg is released within 12 to 24 hours of when you see that surge. However, this is surge in your blood versus surge in your urine, and typically you're testing surge in your urine. So what you're doing is you're building in a little bit of a buffer for, you see the surge, you don't know, you're going to see it one day and you didn't see it the day before, and you don't know where you are in that surge. Is your surge just starting? Is this really the max, the peak of your LH surge, or are you somewhere, on this continuum? Maybe you're here, maybe you're here, maybe you're here. You don't know. And it happens relatively quickly. You'll see it one morning, it won't be there the next, it won't be there the day before. So you don't know. So to add in a safe zone for you, if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, you want to be sure that that egg has fully decayed, fully disintegrated before, is no longer viable, no longer capable of being fertilized. You want to be sure that's the case before you resume unprotected sex. And if you are someone who's, trying to get pregnant, you want to take every opportunity available in order to achieve pregnancy during the cycle, which we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the days when you're most likely to conceive in a separate video. But anyways, so this is why your fertile window is actually longer than, the lifespan of your egg. It's why your fertile window is longer than 5 days. But let's say if you were to have sex here, and then those sperm can live 7 days, that means day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that covers your entire fertile window, right? Like, even if you were to ovulate here or here, it's still possible for the sperm that entered your uterus here, the ones that, entered your vagina, swam through your cervix, up into your uterus, into your fallopian tubes, that they're still able to fertilize that egg here, 7 days later. So, anyways, that's why. Now, this is another visual to help you see how this, visualize this. So you have menses. Then if you have any dry days after menses, between menses and your point of change, this is where that pre-ovulatory G-type mucus would be something that you may observe. You're typically with the G-type mucus, regardless of whether it's pre-ovulatory or post-ovulatory, you may just observe those as dry days, because if your body's not producing enough of that G-type mucus or G-type cervical fluid to slough off, then chances are you're not going to see this when you wipe. It's entirely possible on your EL day to actually observe some G-type mucus first, because that plug was kind of, your body expels that plug first before the kind of this EL mucus washes away or washes out that G plug, and you're able to see that first before you see EL mucus later that day. The one of the things that you're not able to see from this particular chart is how much your cervix itself is actually changing. So your cervical position within your body and the texture of your cervix also changes during your fertile window. It becomes softer, more like your lips, as opposed to hard, like more like the tip of your nose during your fertile days. And it also typically goes higher into your body during your fertile days. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say about this slide. Identifying, how do you identify ovulation? So ovulation typically occurs within 24 to 36 hours after the LH surge. Just know that when it says this is the LH surge in your serum, again, in your blood, and typically what's in your urine. The LH surge in your urine is delayed, if I recall correctly, I believe it's by about 6 hours, maybe up to 12 hours. I believe it's 6 hours. So what you're seeing in your urine is kind of after the fact. Because most of the time I think you'll probably hear me quote 24 hours, and I might have even said 12 to 24 hours. So after the LH surge is when ovulation occurs. And then ovulation also happens within 3 days of either side of your peak day. So how do you know when your peak day is? Your peak day is your last day of fertile quality cervical fluid. So if we were back to this chart, if we're just pulling out, like we're zooming in on this section of the chart here in this slide. This would be your peak day. If you are testing your LH surge, and we'll talk about how to do that, you can do it with ovulation predictor kits. They are not my favorite. There's a separate short video, like microvid, on why I don't like ovulation predictor kits. My favorite way to do this is actually to quantitate it with a Mira fertility monitor. So anyways, ovulation occurs within 24 to 36 hours after your LH surge, or within 3 days of your peak day, and your peak day being the last day of fertile quality cervical fluid. So then with this, let's just talk peak day first. If you're just tracking your cervical fluid and you wake up this morning and yesterday was your last day of fertile quality cervical fluid, when you graph your results at the end of this day and you did not have any fertile quality cervical secretions on this day, you will mark the previous day as your peak day. So this is done by just placing a P either in the box or above the box and then circling it, and then you start a count of 3. So this would be 1, the next day would be 2, and then the third day 3. If you are tracking your LH and you have your LH surge on this day, then you would do a count of 4 after your LH surge. And this is to allow for, so 24 to 36 hours. 24 is 1 day, 36 is a day and a half. And then if we keep in mind that the egg itself can be viable for up to 24 hours, then you want to avoid sex this day if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, and go ahead and give yourself an extra buffer day. The reason for this extra buffer day is in the event that you had more than one developing follicle, because when you have more than one developing follicle, they both don't have to ovulate at the same time. And so this is to build in that extra time. Now, both of those developing follicles would still be impacting your estrogen levels and would still be impacting the quality of your cervical fluid. And so It's just that they would respond differently to the LH surge and might respond a little bit differently in the time that they're released from that LH surge. So it's putting in this extra buffer day for that. That's all I want to say about that. So this is how we identify the estimated time of ovulation. And this also helps you to, kind of track the actual age of a developing fetus as well in the event that you become pregnant this cycle. Now, some women notice sticky, pasty, unchanging mucus. For you, you will chart yellow for those days until you identify whether that's a fertile or an infertile pattern for you. So instead of dry, you would just see sticky, pasty, unchanging mucus on those days. This could be completely normal, just absolutely completely normal, nothing wrong. It could be from delayed ovulation, so this state of kind of cellular proliferation because the endometrial lining grows in response to estrogen. It could be due to inflammation. Typically with that, you would expect to have pelvic pain. You would expect to have something else going on. But if this is new onset for you, it may be indicative of a sexually transmitted infection. It may be indicative of something like bacterial vaginosis. It may be indicative of something more serious like pelvic inflammatory disease. But again, if it's new onset, it's worth consideration. Just know that if you're seeing this cycle after cycle, it's also entirely possible it's just you. So anyways, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. And then finally, this is kind of the difference between different sensation between progesterone affected, and again, I really wish this said G and not progesterone dominant type cervical secretions, being cloudy, being thick, being scant, like having those three qualities, so there's just not much of it, or not having any observations and just recording that as a dry day. When your estrogen is rising, you will get more of a moist, slippery sensation when you wipe. When your estrogen is high, this is seriously where it looks like uncooked raw egg whites. Clear, thin, stretchy, abundant, very fluid, very slippery, copious amounts of stretchy cervical fluid. And then I don't feel like this slide necessarily adds anything. This will be available for you as a download. If you have any questions on this, we'll definitely take those up in a one-on-one session. If it becomes worthwhile to, go deeper into this, like if there's a lot of questions that I repeatedly get about this particular slide, which again will be available for a download, then, I'll address those in a separate video. All right, how do you chart your cycle? This one, I apologize for it being a little hard to see. I am unable to zoom in on this particular slide. You will chart red for days when you are bleeding. You will also, you can fill that in with a colored marker. It's also just fine to write here on your color as R, G for gray, or LB for blue, or DB for dark blue, or Y for yellow. If you don't have all of these different colors, don't worry about it. Just record the letter, the corresponding letter. And then what else is helpful? Well, the other things that are helpful is here you'll see that there's these symbols here. It's helpful to record those. So if it's a heavy day for you for bleeding, if you could write H, and even go so far as to tell me how many pads you use that day, how many tampons you use that day, or how many pairs of period underwear you use that day. And if it is period underwear, like what, which one? So if it was, for me, I use NYX, and if it's the super absorbent ones versus the non super absorbent ones, so the ones that will absorb up to 5 pads worth versus the ones that will absorb up to 3 pads worth, like that is really helpful, just to make a note of. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, just how many times did you change it and what did you change it to that day. G, if you're again, if you don't have colored pencils or crayons or whatever to record the colors, and you just want to write G, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to record G twice here in the charting symbol. Just G in your color is fine. EL, if you want to write EL instead of LB for light blue, that's also perfectly fine. ES for high estrogen instead of DB for dark blue, that's totally fine. When you see this transition between your ES back over to your dry type cervical fluid, you will write 1, 2, or 3 here in your symbol. And this is a visual cue for you too, to know that you have done your 3 days. This is especially important if you're avoiding pregnancy. And then if there's anything that is confusing, or if there are any days where you see that sticky, cloudy mucus of any quantity, whether it's scanty or whether, you feel like it's copious, record yellow. So record Y for yellow, and then if you can include in the notes, what you saw, like, confusing and this is why. That's really helpful. And so that's it. This particular chart will go out to 35 days. If you need, you don't have to record the date every day. If you just want to record the date that your cycle starts, that's sufficient. If you need more and this becomes confusing because now you're on cycle day 50 and you're losing track of where this is, or if your cycle goes past 35 days or you think it's going to go past 35 days, reach out to me. I have I'm more than happy to print out. I'm more than happy to send you over a spreadsheet. If you want to do this on the computer, I'm more than happy to talk with you about apps too, which we will talk about apps in a different module. All right, speaking of apps, this is the FEM app. It is available for download either through Google Play or available through the Apple App Store. This is one app completely free. We'll go over the FEM app, compare it with a couple of other apps as well, again, in a separate video. So stay tuned for that. All right, so that wraps up this kind of basic introduction to how you're able to use cervical fluid to know when ovulation is near. That wraps up kind of a basic overview of fertility awareness, honestly. So thank you so much for joining me for this first session, and I'm looking forward to additional sessions with you. In the meantime, as you're charting this cycle, reach out with any questions that you have. All right, bye.